Today is December 9th, 2019. I'm Ken Schoen with the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts, and I have the pleasure today of interviewing Ron Ackerman, formerly of Brooklyn, New York, and now residing in Northampton, Massachusetts. Ron, why don't we begin by you telling us, how did you, a Brooklyn kid, end up in the wilds of Northampton?
First, a disclaimer, Ken and I are good friends. So now that you know that, it's wonderful to sit here opposite my buddy. And how I got here was I married a woman from Springfield, and we took a trip to Israel when our son was a year old. And the question was, coming back from Israel, where are we going to live? And the whole country was open to us. So we thought, gee, Cleo has a sister living in Conway, Mass. And she's got 4 kids, and we have 1, and they're all about the same age. And why not move in with her and live collectively with her family? They have a big house up in Conway, all these kids, and we didn't have jobs or anything, so we were going to live at home, taking care of the kids and enjoying life. So we moved in with them. After a year of 5 children, 4 of whom were in diapers, and we only had 1 of them, we decided that this wasn't quite working for us. So we went looking for other places to live in the area because we fell in love with the area. We got involved with different collectives up in Franklin County. One was a work collective, because none of us really were looking for full-time jobs. We were looking for social action, participation. And how do you do that when you're working full-time? Then there was, of course, a women's support group that Cleo was involved in. And then there was a Jewish support group. How do we, as Jews who aren't religiously involved, express our Judaism, feel our Judaism? So, and there were many Jewish members of these collectives. So we were involved in that collective. And after a year of living with Cleo's sister and brother-in-law, and a cousin who moved in with us to finish high school, and 5 little ones, we decided it was time to become a nuclear family. And we looked around. We looked in Coleraine. We looked in Deerfield, and finally found a place in Northampton that spoke to us. So that's what brought us here. But why I'm sitting here is because I'm Gabbai of Congregation B'nai Israel, and have been for, gee, I don't even know how long, since the last Gabbai became too old to be able to do the job by himself. Mel Prouser. Mel Prouser was our Gabbai for 40 years. Fantastic, kind, gentle, welcoming person. Anyone who walked in the door became part of us. So my background in Brooklyn had to do with my involvement at Congregation B'nai Israel. CBI was the only shul in Northampton at the time.
What year is this?
This was 1971 or 2. And as a matter of fact, when we first moved to Northampton and went to CBI, the rabbi was Rabbi Langenauer, who changed his name to Bar Zev, ultimately left the job to move to Florida to become a stockbroker, and was very successful. But we arrived with a 1-year-old child to come to check out services. And were not welcomed because our 1-year-old child was a typical 1-year-old who blah, 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 and crawled around. And they felt at the time that it disturbed the service. And we were asked to take our child out of the sanctuary. Not to leave, but could we take our child out of the sanctuary? Well, we didn't come back for a number of years until Rabbi Langenauer decided to leave. and didn't really attend shul much. I come from a Brooklyn background where my parents were conservative Jews. And my parents decided to send me to a yeshiva for elementary school. At that time, there were no Hebrew day schools, so yeshivas were, of course, all Orthodox. And I went to my father was a working class person who drove a pickup truck to deliver coats and aprons and to stores, and it was a one-truck business, and I knew as a teenager that he couldn't afford to send me there, but what I realized was he was delivering coats and aprons and towels to their kitchen, and that I was there on scholarship. So for 8 years at the yeshiva, I learned a lot.
What was the name of the yeshiva?
Yeshiva Rambam, it was called.
Where was it?
It was just north of Nostrand Avenue and Kings Highway, on Kings Highway. And we were all working class kids. And there were a few Orthodox, but the majority were not Orthodox, but we got an Orthodox education. And one of our teachers was a rabbi who lived in my neighborhood, and I remember being invited to his sukkah every year. And that obviously was meaningful to me because I still remember it with pleasure. So there were a lot of parts of that I really enjoyed. I was a typical working class kid, though, and I remember sitting outside of the principal's office a number of times throughout my years at the yeshiva. Another thing about the yeshiva that stood out to me was we had to wear tzitzit katan. Tzitzit katan are those, a talis with fringes, but that had a hole so it slipped over your head and you wore it under your shirt, because in Orthodox Judaism you're supposed to wear tzitzit all the time. Not at bedtime, but all the time that you're awake. I didn't do that. And what I learned the hard way was the teachers or the principal would walk around school and tap kids on the back. And I thought they were just being friendly. But I learned pretty quickly that I got caught not wearing my tzitzit many times, sent to the office, and had to buy a new pair to put on at the moment. After my first half dozen new tzitzit that had to be bought, did I get a lecture from my father. We weren't rich. We were pretty poor folks. And this extra expense of these tzitzit that I had to buy became a problem. So I started wearing them. But it tells you a lot about what my religiosity at home was like. We were kosher. I had to go to shul because I was at yeshiva. My father actually went to work Saturday mornings. But I probably resented that.
Where was your father from?
My father was from a little town in what at the time was Austria, called Premishlana, and there was a Hasidic Rebbe there called the Premishlana Rebbe, and it changed from Polish to Austrian to Czech to, depending on what the politics of the time were. It was part of different countries. And he came here during, probably right after World War I. A cute little story. My sister went off to Buffalo State Teachers College. She was the first one in our family to go to college. Nobody else on either side of my family at that time had made it to college. And she came home after her first semester, during semester break, and said, "Dad, they're giving out scholarships if you had a parent or grandparent who fought in World War I. And my father said, "Get the paperwork. Grandpa fought in World War I. She got the paperwork, she brought it home. I was sitting at the table with them while they were filling out the papers, and it got to the point of asking, well, what division was he in, and what was his rank, and yada yada. And my father said, oh, he was in the Austrian cavalry. And my sister looked at him and said, Dad, that was the wrong side. I don't think I'm going to get a scholarship for him fighting in World War I on the wrong side. Well, obviously I remember that, and that stuck with me. So that's when his family came over.
Did he come with his parents?
He came with his parents, and his half-sisters, who were much older than he was, had come. First, one sister came independently and started working and brought another sister over. These were all half-sisters who came and worked independently, who brought a third sister over who came, and between the three of them, they earned enough money to bring over my father and his full sister and the parents. So they all arrived at different times here, doing different, very working class. No one was educated, so very working class kinds of jobs that they all participated in. And my grandfather became a baker and worked in a Jewish bakery on the Lower East Side, where the only language he needed was Yiddish, and it's the only language he learned. And my grandmother was the businesswoman who took his earnings and saved them to the point of being able to buy a 4-family house in Brooklyn.
Where?
In not quite Flatbush, but on the fringe of Flatbush, Kings Highway and Coney Island Avenue, if you know Brooklyn. And like many homes there, they became family homes. My grandparents lived in one apartment. My parents lived in the second apartment. And 2 of those older sisters lived in the other 2 apartments. Next door to us was the 3rd older sister. And around the corner, well, when I was growing up, of course, they were all older and married, was my father's full sister, who also lived in the neighborhood. So I grew up in this neighborhood of family. It was half Italian, the neighborhood, and half Jewish. And connected to us was another 4-family home. We shared a wall. And in that family home was the identical collection of relatives of the Italian family. And my grandfather and the Italian grandfather would get together every couple of years to decide what color to paint the stoops on their connected buildings so they would look the same. It was very nice. And they had a daughter about my age, and as a young teen, I got to like her, and she sat on my lap once time, and I don't know who in which family noticed, but I got a lecture from my father about no fraternizing with the Italian girls, and I'm sure she got the same lecture from her family about not fraternizing with the Jewish boys.
Did your father have much of a Jewish education in the fact that he sent you to yeshiva?
Enough of a Jewish education that when he moved to Florida, he became the Gabbai in Florida.
That's lovely.
At his shul, right. So because of his work, he never got overly involved in the Brooklyn shul.
Did your family all get together on Friday night, this whole big shtetl you had together?
No, they didn't. Even in the same home, the same building where there were 4 of us, everybody did their own thing.
Where did you go to high school? You didn't continue in yeshiva?
I did.
Oh, you did?
Unhappily. My father was delivering coats and aprons to Yeshiva of Flatbush, just down Coney Island Avenue. We were at Coney Island Avenue in S and Coney Island Avenue in J, and it goes in order so you can count how many blocks away it was. There was a great bus that went right there, and public bus. And they enrolled me at Yeshiva of Flatbush as a freshman in 9th grade. By the end of 9th grade, it was an 8 to 5 school and a half day on Sundays. By the end of my freshman year, watching all of my neighborhood friends get out of school at 3 o'clock and have weekends off, I decided something was not right here. And I convinced my mother to enroll me at Lincoln High School. During the summer, my father heard about it and went berserk, grabbed me and took me back to the yeshiva, and had me have a discussion with the principal of the yeshiva. And I was stupid and tuned him out and wasn't listening to a word he was saying. And at the end of the discussion, when it was time to leave, the rabbi and my father said, "Well, is that okay?" And I said, "Sure," and stormed out of there. And what I agreed to was to stay at the yeshiva, unbeknown to me. So I spent the next 3 years at the yeshiva unhappily.
But you did get a good Jewish education.
I got a great Jewish education. So when, as an adult, I finally joined CBI, and Mel Prauser was the Gabbai, and just by watching him, I learned a lot. And as my son became age of Hebrew school, my wife and I joined CBI and enrolled our son in the Hebrew school. And I started going to services a little more often and watched Mel work. Mel was the Gabbai, and at the time, Hai Kantrowitz was the shamus. And they each had their roles, and they were there a lot and doing what they needed to do. And because of my background, I was kind of interested and watched what they were doing and learned a lot from both of them.
What did each one do for responsibilities?
Mel handled the services, organizing them, giving out aliyot, rolling the Torah, making sure everything was organized for all of the holidays, and doing everything that revolved around ritual. And Hai got everything ready. He made sure the books were in their place, that the talesim were folded, that the Gregors were ordered, that the flags were there for each of the holidays, that all the things that were needed. So he was, as the shamus in the Hanukkah menorah, he watched out on making sure that everything that was needed for the service was going to be there and available. And it was Mel's job to make sure that everything connected with the service then would flow. And he was up there calling people up for aliyot and giving out the honors and doing all of that. When Hai became too old to do that, we happened to have had a member, a young woman named Martha Gray, who took over from him and continued doing it until she moved to the eastern part of the state. And when she moved to the eastern part of the state, there was nobody interested to just step up and take over. So Mel, by that time, Mel's wife was deceased, Ann Prauser, and he took on both jobs. And Cleo at one time asked him and said, "Mel, how can you do both jobs? It's so involving." And his response was, "If Ann were alive, I wouldn't be doing both jobs. She would never allow me to spend this much time at the shul. But she's deceased, and it fills that hole for me. So I'm here a lot, and it's a good place to be." And as Mel got older, he needed help. I had the background. I had the knowledge. So I started helping him. And he taught me a lot. He taught me how he gave out the honors. He taught me how he rolled the Torah. He taught me how he got organized for the high holidays. And when it got more challenging for him, he invited me to his house, and the two of us together had everything spread out on his dining room table and organized the high holidays, from arranging the honors cards that would be given out to people who were opening the ark, who were doing readings, who were leading part of the service, and he and I worked together for quite a few years before he became too old to be able to do it anymore. And then I was consulting with him regularly and doing it.
When did you take over approximately? How long ago?
Oh, boy. Oh, it's probably 15 years ago now, maybe even a little longer.
So the rabbi and cantor of the shul are not involved in this process. It's all within your territory.
The rabbi, for the high holidays, the rabbi decides what the flow of the service was going to be like, and this is way back before our current rabbis, and would put it on paper so Mel would know which prayers needed to have a layperson helping with opening the ark, with reading an English reading, with leading part of a service, doing all of these roles that the rabbi and the chazan weren't going to do, but that community members were going to be given the honor. So the rabbi is involved by then and now getting that list from the previous year, having to review it, to update it, to make whatever changes that he wants made, and then giving it back to the Gabbai so the Gabbai can have the right cards made up for those honors to give out to people, so that the flow of the service was going to be smooth, and there would be people just going right up for whatever page we had reached that needed them to do one of those honors.
When you go back, let's say 20, 30 years ago, did you have a cantor as a position there? And if you did, who was the cantor? And did you have different people reading Torah? And if they read Torah, were they reading like a third, what we do now, or were they reading the whole Torah portion? What was it like, let's say, 30 years ago? How did that evolve?
What good questions. Well, we have during our regular year, we do not have a chazan. The rabbi leads the service or finds lay people who are interested in leading the service. And different rabbis had different tendencies. So some rabbis, and Phil Graubart, our previous rabbi, liked to have members lead services. But when members weren't leading it, he would lead it, so that there was no paid chazan. For the high holidays, we had a paid chazan. And it was usually for us, when we had a member who could do it, a member. And our longest serving chazan was also the person who leaned Torah for us on a regular basis. And I don't really recall when the shift happened from laning the whole service to laning a third. Primarily what I remember is that we always laned a third and went in unison with the conservative movement, whatever the third was they were doing that year. So Shlomo Bar Nun, and from Israel, who was a professor at the university and was a member of our shul, laned Torah for us, the entire portion that we read every week. And we, who were not quite as proficient at it as he, would sit there in awe of what a beautiful job he would do laning every week, almost seemingly off the cuff. I'm sure he looked at it once or twice before we got there. And he was also the person we hired, and I put that in quotes, because he never took the money for it. The money he used to pay his dues and then to give us a donation to the shul. So he was doing it out of love. And he was a traditionalist who led in a traditional manner with the traditional melodies, and we loved it. It was really a blessing to have him. And he did it for a number of decades for us. And now we have another member of the shul. After him, there was Felicia. There were two Felicias. One followed the other. One was Felicia Sloan, and one was Felicia. I'm not going to remember her last name now. I'm sorry. She's deceased. I can picture her. But anyway, we hired them to when Shlomo left, to be our chazan. And that's how we continue to do it. So Felicia Sloan is still our chazan, and on the high holidays.
And the melodies are quite different.
And the melodies are quite different. When Shlomo left, there was a move on the part of the rabbi to bring in new melodies, more current melodies, and the shift was made to that, yes. And when we talk about leading services, when our current rabbi was hired, and of course we had a 3-year break between the last rabbi and this rabbi, so without a rabbi for 3 years, the community stepped in to do everything, to lane, to lead the services, just to do everything that a rabbi would do. We did hire rabbis. We have many rabbis in the community, and we hired rabbis to do weddings and burials, and often bar and bat mitzvahs as well. But when this rabbi was hired,
What's his name, the current rabbi?
Justin David, and I was the Gabbai, and I said to him, you know, you don't have to lead all the services, that we have been doing it for 3 years, so we have quite a crew who are more than happy to do it. His response was so interesting to me at the time. He said, you know, Ron, I really like reading services. It allows me to pray. When I'm just sitting back there and somebody else is leading services, I have a tendency to notice who's walking in, to think about my devar, and not so much focused on my prayer. So I really enjoy doing it. I respected him enormously for that. He's been with us 15, 16, 17 years now, and he is much more open to having community members lead. He encourages our bar and bat mitzvah kids to lead prior to, so that when it's their bar and bat mitzvah, they are ready and more comfortable. And he encourages them to lead after their bar and bat mitzvahs too, if they're coming to services.
Who reads the Torah portion each week now?
Many different people. And we're fortunate to have Justin, our rabbi, who can do it on the spur of the moment, so that if someone is not there, or if there is no one who has signed up to lane, he's our fallback person.
Who are the other Gabbais who work with you?
Well, remember I told you that Mel did it by himself, everything by himself. So when I started, that was my model. And I was doing it by myself and doing both roles, Gabbai and Shamas, by myself. And I must say that my wife has reacted, my wife Cleo Gorman, has reacted similarly to the way Mel described Ann's response to all that work that he was doing. So she encouraged me to get others to help. And during the year after my mother died, at age 93, I came back to shul, and I really was not comfortable being up on the bima every Shabbat being Gabbai. My feeling was that you needed to be joyful, to be on the bima in front of God and helping the congregation with its prayer, and I wasn't feeling joyful. So I organized other knowledgeable people to have one person which is Monroe Rabin, to do the first Shabbat of the month. A second person, Alan Singer, does the second Shabbat of the month. A third person, Dave Goldstone, who does the third Shabbat of the month. A fourth person, Henry Simkin, who did the fourth Shabbos of the month. And when there's a fifth Shabbat, Ruth Ever would cover that, and they would cover the holidays between them. After that year of mourning for my mother, I came back, but really didn't want to take back that full role because I felt that it's important for a synagogue to have many people who can do many things. So Ruth got a job which didn't allow her the flexibility to just pick up on the fifth Shabbat of the month and step in. So I took the fifth Shabbat of the month, and I do the Shamus work.
Tell me about the membership of CBI. I have the sense that the membership has evolved. When I belonged to CBI, shall we say, 20 years ago, it was a lot of older people who were quite conservative in their beliefs and came to shul on Shabbos, but there were a lot of older people. How has the shul evolved in terms of its membership over the last 20 or 30 years? Also in terms of numbers, what's been happening at CBI? How would you describe it?
Yeah. When I joined the shul 40 years ago, there were 100 members. And they knew every Jew in town. And the membership committee, which was chaired by Eleanor Adelson, would do outreach to any Jewish person or any name that sounded Jewish who moved into the area and encouraged them to join. I ended up working with Ellen Adelson in the East Hampton School Department and, of course, was encouraged to join at that time as well. So there were 100 members, and that was our membership for many, many decades. And then slowly, more Jews started moving into the community who were interested in joining, and we started inching up, and over time, to 150, to 200 members, and it kind of plateaued at about 300 members, which was very good. And many younger families came, and our religious school grew from 25 students to 50 students to 100 students. And that growth was quite wonderful. And not that they were attenders at services. It was usually when the child got near bar and bat mitzvah age that they started bringing the family to services. So we didn't see much of a change, and you were right. For many years, those who were coming to services were the older, the more religious, not the younger who tended to be more progressive and liberal. But they were members. And that change started impacting the kind of rabbis we were hiring. They became less religious themselves. So after Langenauer, we had still a religious rabbi named Ed Friedman, whose focus was on ritual participation. Well, a lot of our younger families, that didn't really meet their needs. So after a few years, actually in contrast to him, we hired a young Reconstructionist rabbi, Alan Morse. He had young children, and he came from a totally different perspective as a Reconstructionist rabbi, and it really spoke to our young families. Well, he decided to move to Israel, and a new rabbi was hired, also a young rabbi, Phil Graubart, and Phil stayed with us for 10 years and helped increase our membership. And with 300 members and a young rabbi with a family, he was able to frame the service and the holidays to meet their needs. And they started getting involved. So that Hanukkah, we had Hanukkah celebrations for kids. And for Pesach, we had a model Seder that was kid-oriented. And it started attracting people of younger families to services. And, of course, we had a children's service then that developed. So that helped us grow with young families. And a number of years ago, there was a push for a Hebrew day school, the Solomon Schechter School. With the creation of the Solomon Schechter School, we now had a draw for more religious young families because they had a place to send their kids where they wanted them to get the Jewish education. Our next rabbi, Justin David, really spoke to them. And he was a much more progressive liberal rabbi. So although initially he was 3 years out of Jewish Theological Seminary when he was hired, he followed all the rules and dictates of conservative Judaism. I felt he wasn't quite secure himself to be able to be flexible in how we did things. With years of being our rabbi and feeling more secure in his role, he was able to be much more flexible and much more open to diversity. And we now have moved from starting out as an Orthodox synagogue when we were created over 100 years ago to being a progressive egalitarian synagogue that's very involved in social justice work, very involved in young people's activities in the Jewish realm, and ultimately starting a farm on synagogue property focused on social justice. This has attracted a whole new wave of people who are wanting to be involved in progressive social justice work as Jews. So we are now at 400 members in our synagogue. Only 50 to 60 children in our religious school because so many are going to LGA, now called the Lander Grinspoon Academy. So that the other 50 that used to be in our religious school are over there. But having this double frame of ritual participation and social justice has us trying to balance a significant number of interfaith family members and I'm talking about young families, and a significant number of young families who are traditionally observant. Just 2 years ago, we took a vote to make the non-Jewish partner of our interfaith families, instead of being associate members of the synagogue, they're not Jewish, and our bylaws say to be a member of our synagogue, you have to be Jewish. I should correct that. Our bylaws said that. We decided they weren't feeling fully welcomed, even though the non-Jewish spouse was generally the one who was most involved because the Jewish spouse was out working. And they were the ones bringing the kid to religious school, bringing their child to services, bringing their child to holidays, and yet they were not feeling fully welcomed. A vote was taken to change our bylaws, make them full members with just a few restrictions that ritual calls for Jewish, the need to be Jewish, like having an aliyah.
There's also an interfaith place in the cemetery.
And this happened before that. One of our members who was an interfaith marriage, and I'm forgetting his name right now.
Dennis Hudson.
No, not
It wasn't
Dennis.
Dennis.
No, it wasn't Dennis. These are two authors. The parents are two authors. The adults were two authors. We thought the wife was Jewish. We don't ask those questions. It's not nice to ask if you converted or not. As a matter of fact, Judaism says once someone converts, they're Jewish, and you shouldn't be looking back past that. He died. We did Tahara, which is Jewish preparation of a deceased for burial. We marked out a site for him, and he was buried at a city cemetery. And we went to the wife to say, what was that about? And she said, I wanted to be buried next to him. And we dropped our jaws and said, oh, we had no idea.
So Norman Kotker.
Exactly. And Zane Kotker is the wife. Thank you so much, Norman Kotker. And that is what ultimately moved us to creating an interfaith cemetery. As a cemetery co-chair and as Chevra Kadisha co-chair, I do the legwork to find out how do you make this kosher. And at the time, what I learned was that a synagogue cannot be responsible for a non-Jewish cemetery. And by burying non-Jews there, it's considered not sanctified ground, so therefore the synagogue cannot be in charge of that. And at the time, we also had too small of a cemetery to have space to set off a separate area for them. Right next to our cemetery is the Hebrew Cemetery Society, which was founded by German Jews who first moved here in the late 1800s. They were the first Jews to live here, and the first thing they did was to buy land for a cemetery. Turn of the next century, in the early 1900s, the Ashkenazim started coming from Eastern Europe. And it was probably the same time that my family migrated here as well. My family went to Brooklyn. Some of them came here, and
They were farmers, they were cattle dealers, they were merchants.
They were farmers, cattle dealers, merchants, with their wagons on the street, going to people's neighborhoods, selling things, correct, all of this stuff. And the Germans, at the time, weren't so interested in mingling. There were no shuls here yet. But there was the cemetery, and there was this land. And what the German members of that German cemetery did was to give us a piece of the land, give those Ashkenazi Jews who were arriving a piece of that land for their cemetery. The members of that, and they closed their membership to the original members, and they limited who could be buried in their cemetery to their members and the descendants of their members. When a synagogue was formed, it was formed from both communities, and as their community aged and started having difficulty supporting their own cemetery, they came to us.
That was Jim Raymond, probably.
This was Judy and Jim Raymond, who were taking care of the German cemetery, who were very active members and on the board of Congregation B'nai Israel. And they said, we're getting older. We can foresee the day when we can't take care of our own cemetery. You're going to be here forever. We would like you to take care of our cemetery, and we'll give you another piece of the land that we own, adjacent to the land that you gave us, if you'll take care of our cemetery and do the maintenance and upkeep. Well, how could we say no? So in that new section that we were given, we were able to set off this interfaith cemetery. The two rules were, one, we could not, the CBI, Congregation B'nai Israel, could not be the ones who ran that cemetery. I ostensibly really shouldn't own the land, but we did. We set up a separate cemetery committee made up of some of our members and actually made up of more of the non-Jewish spouses to take care of that cemetery. It needed to be set off from ours. We had a road built on one side. We put it in a corner so the two other sides were set off by the boundary, and we had bushes planted on the fourth side, so it really was a separate section that was set aside for our interfaith families. This is now 2 years ago. So this was prior, this is probably 10 years ago. And 2 years ago, we made those interfaith, those non-Jewish spouses full members of our synagogue. So we are reaching out to them. And now at the same time, we're needing to reach out to these more religious members who are joining us, who are moving to the area, wanting us to follow more of the dictates of traditional Judaism.
Halacha.
They want us to follow the halacha. The halacha says you don't brew coffee on Shabbat. So they want a Shabbat hot water heater which heats the water to almost boiling, and they put out instant coffee. So you don't have to have the brewed coffee. They also would like us to install Shabbos lights, meaning have an electrician come in and hook up a system that would automatically turn lights on and off on Shabbat and Chagim.
So they might be called conservadox, but let me ask you, do they have any issues with the liturgy, with the prayer book as it's being read now, which is, I guess, has made some changes in traditional, perhaps the interpretations are different than the Orthodox prayer?
They don't have issue with the prayer book per se. Many of them bring their own. The issues with the service, they would love to have us do full laning. Why only do a third?
Full Torah service.
Right, the whole Torah service. They would love to have us repeat the Amida.
Don't you do that, don't you?
No,
You don't do Musaf?
we do Musaf, but we do the Kedusha first. We start the
Amida and then the Kedusha, and you don't repeat.
We start the Amida, we do the Kedusha, and we don't repeat. We have a tradition that whoever the Chazan gets the choice to do it their way, and gets the choice to use the nigunim, the melodies that they want to use. If you're volunteering, we accept your way of volunteering. So when someone's volunteering who wants to do the full repetition of the Amida, we get the full repetition of the Amida. With them being there, I find that our rabbi is also doing the full repetition on occasion, depending on timing. He gets a lot of feedback when the service runs till 12:15 or 12:30 instead of ending at 12. Negative feedback.
Why is that? People think like the service starts at 10 o'clock? Is that
9:30.
It's at 9:30. So we've been here 2.5 hours. That's enough? I mean, if they're coming to pray, wouldn't they just say we want the whole Megillah, so to speak? Give us 3 hours if that's what it takes?
the majority of our members are not traditional. The majority of our members tend to be there for community. And as a matter of fact, one of our former presidents, Norbert Goldfield, you know how presidents give their speech at the high holidays, and many of them use it for fundraising, but they talk to the community, because that's when the community's there. So we have 600 people in the room, and Norbert got up to give his president's speech, and it was a shocker to people like me. Norbert started his speech by saying, I want everyone to know that I am a secular Jew. And I dropped my jaw and I thought, what is a secular Jew doing being the president of a synagogue, of a religious organization that promotes belief in God? We don't ask those questions in advance, and we rarely have a contest for the president of the synagogue. It's usually finding someone willing to take it on. So it wasn't as if we were choosing, but this was our president, a secular Jew. And he said, my goal is to build community. And if you can only come for Kiddush and be part of the community. Well, my jaw dropped again. Here I thought you had to do the work of praying first before you got to eat. And he was saying, nope, come join our community, be part of our community, and come and eat. And our Kiddush changed from being challah and some cookies and some fruit to being a luncheon.
Catered by?
Often catered by Bianca Cooperman, who's a phenomenal caterer and is a caterer. And when she's doing it for the shul, it's under a different hat. It's under the hat of Kiddush maker. And she doesn't do it every week. We now have a Kiddush committee.
How is the kashrut observed?
We have members. We have over a million, over 10 members who are rabbis. And
can you think of their names? What comes to mind?
Nancy Flam, Kevin Hale, both, and Ricky Kosovsky, who's the rabbi at the Reform Shul, which started in our town not too long ago, and is a member of our shul, and her husband David Seidenberg, who is a conservative rabbi who is a member in our shul, Ed Feld, Aryeh Weinman, Bruce Bromberg-Seltzer, there are more. I'm blocking now. But so, and usually one of the spouses and also spouses of our more religious members have joined the Kiddush committee to make sure that our kitchen is kosher. At one time, Bruce Bromberg-Seltzer was our mashgiach and actually koshered our kitchen himself for Pesach. And Joe Morse has also in the past been our mashgiach in the kitchen. So we have had members who did that. Now it's the committees that do it, and Bianca, who's kind of keeps an eye on it.
So CBI has quite a few members who might describe themselves as ethnic Jews or cultural Jews or secular Jews, and they're coming to CBI for community or for social events or for cultural events or lectures or music. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's very accurate. And to be in Jewish community. We had an Israeli couple, Tzvi Oren and his wife Ora, who moved here because their grandchild is here, and came to shul after they moved here. And I welcome people, so I went over and welcomed them and said, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm looking for being part of a Jewish community. I'm Israeli, I'm a secular Jew. I don't come to pray, but I want to be part of a Jewish community. That's what life is like for me. And I was talking to the Israelis around here. He lives in Amherst, and there's an Israeli contingent affiliated with the University of Massachusetts and the other colleges in the area. And he met them and was talking to them. And his question to them was, well, where do you go to be part of a Jewish community? And their answer to him was, you join a shul. And they said, you join a shul? What do you do that for? And he said, that's where Jews gather around here. And he joined CBI. And he, like many of the others who now come for Kiddush, to be part of the Jewish community in Shmuz.
We might mention that there's also a Reform Shul and a Chabad. Can you mention what the Reform Shul is called?
Beit Ahava is the Reform Shul.
It's
led by Rabbi Ricky Kosofsky.
And that's in Florence?
And that's in Florence, Mass. And they are renting, along with the church, the Florence Congregational Church, which is still functioning. And they rent space there because it's not used on Shabbat and holidays when they need it.
So they've got a big membership. It's mostly Friday night, I think. They have a big membership.
They have Shabbat 2 Friday nights a month, and Saturday mornings primarily when there are bar and bat mitzvahs or chagim or that kind of thing. Yeah.
There's also a Chabad in town, which is next to the high school.
The Chabad is newer, and yes, there is. The Chabad is Tuvia and
Helfen, right?
Helfen, yes, Rabbi Tuvia. And Tamar.
And they get a turnout on, I think, 2 Shabbats.
I don't.
Shabbos is a month, but he's also the rabbi down in Holyoke now.
He recently became the part-time rabbi in Holyoke at Rodfei, the Orthodox Synagogue in Holyoke.
And there was for a time an Orthodox minion at CBI.
Unfortunately, maybe it's just last year, we were very traditional in having our Hebrew school 2 days a week and on Sunday morning. And the majority of our young families who have kids in the Hebrew school felt that that was way too much for their kids. Their kids were involved in sports and music and theater, and which most Jewish kids are involved in. And this was getting to the conflict. Their kids were missing too much of one or the other. So it got cut back to 1 day after school and Sunday mornings. And then actually, for theoretical reasons, for philosophical reasons, they decided to change it from Sunday morning to Saturday morning, Shabbat morning. So the religious school is there now Shabbat morning. So our 50 religious school kids are there using all of our other space. So unfortunately, we do not have a room available for them anymore. For the Orthodox minion that was meeting in one of our classrooms. Not only that, but prior to moving them to Saturday, we had what we called alternative services in the library. So we had a contemplative service. We had a Qigong Jewish Qigong service. We had a learner's service. These were all taking place in the library because it was a little bit bigger room. We had a musical service. If anybody who wanted to volunteer and lead a service that they loved, we were open to it. Unfortunately, now that the Hebrew school's on Saturday, none of that has room to happen in our building. Some of it is happening at the Solomon Schechter School, Lander Grinspoon, which is on our campus. We leased them the land to build their building for $1 a year for 99 years, and they were able to raise the funds to put up their building. And because it's right on our campus, sharing the same parking lot, we get to use their facility, especially on Shabbat and Chagim when they're closed.
Who is the head of the Hebrew school? And he also runs the Abundance Farm.
Yeah, Rabbi Jacob Fine. prior to him was Allison Morse. And really, it was Emmett Leader. I'm going to take a step back. Next to us, on one side of us, is the city-owned land and a building that used to be the water building that it's used by the DPW. On the other side of us is the Survival Center, which takes care of people in need of food and other support services, so which is also a nonprofit, just on the other side of our driveway. So this is what surrounds us. The Survival Center, the Lander Ginsburg Academy, and the city property. The city is looking to sell their property, and we approached them and said, could we buy the land part up to your parking lot, because we see the need to extend our building, and that would be the perfect direction for us to build out. They sold us that land. Emmett Leader, one of our members, said, hey, it's just sitting there. How about if I start a little farm, and we can use our crops for our kiddush, and any extra crops we can give to the Survival Center. How can we say no? It's a lovely idea. He was willing to do it, so he went and he started a farm. And we got all this fresh food, not only for ourselves, but for the Survival Center. Well, Allison Morse, who is our religious school teacher, principal, she loved the idea of the farm, and the farm grew and did its thing. And she ran our religious school. And then we were looking to expand the role and change it from religious school principal to educational director. And when we did that, we were not thinking of increasing our budget. We were thinking of increasing the role and the title, and going for it. We tried hiring new people who had this broader background. First two people we hired, it just didn't work out. And the third person we hired was a rabbi, Jacob Fine, who loved the farm. Not that he had any background in it, but just, he did have, I don't know about that.
He was with the farm movement.
Really? I had no idea he was with the farm movement. But loved the farm, and really decided to enhance the role of the farm in the Hebrew school and in the community. And wrote grants, and hired a farm manager, hired a farm educator, hired over time a second farm educator, and expanded it to the point of literally providing more than could ever be needed for ourselves, and encouraging the Survival Center to have their members come to the farm to pick their own.
To glean.
Not just to glean, to pick what they wanted at harvest time. So it wasn't gleaning leftovers, it was the purpose of the farm is pick your own, no charge, give away, free. So all the produce is free. There's a sign, pick your own. There's a stand along the road where excess is put out for anyone to take. And students from all over, Jewish and non-Jewish, are encouraged to come and work on the farm. To the point where there are so many people coming to help on the farm that a second plot of land was offered to Abundance Farm to be used to grow more crops. And it's about 6 blocks away from the shul on Jackson Street. Private land that the owner said, I'm not building on it, I'm not using on it, would you like to use as a farm? So it is an educational and a Tikkun Olam Tzedakah event paid for by donations and fundraising. And it's expanded the focus of CBI in that area of social justice enormously.
And brought in a lot of young people.
And brought in a lot of young people who are connected to the Jewish farm movement, that have heard about it and who are moving here for that reason. It's just astounding, the growth that has happened in those two areas. Orthodox, I don't want to call it Orthodox because we're not an Orthodox shul, but the conservadox young people who are coming because they see this Jewish social service stuff going on that they can connect with. It's quite wonderful.
Could you go back for a moment to the Tahara, to the cemetery committee?
Sure.
Could you tell me who's been the head of it and what family has been the head of it, about them, and who are the current members? I'd like some names.
Well, first the history. As far as I go back, so that's 45 years, the Allen family and Jimmy Allen and Sarah Allen were the ones I knew when I moved here who were still alive. They were the ones who took care of the cemetery. So Jimmy Allen had a committee, and they did everything that was connected with the cemetery. And then he had two sons, Phil and Eddie Allen, who had a business here in town, waste management business here in town, who, when father got too old, the two brothers, Phil and Eddie, took his place running the cemetery. And it was such a blessing. They had connections with the German cemetery, so as we were growing and they were shrinking and they were looking for help from us, Eddie was able to negotiate with them and make this arrangement for us to get more land so we could have an interfaith cemetery and have a cemetery that was going to last us for generations, and they would have theirs taken care of. So Eddie and Phil really took care of our cemetery for decades after their father got to be too old and ultimately passed away, and mother as well. And when they retired and sold their business, Phil moved to Florida full time, and Eddie decided that he would spend time in Florida. He now, initially it was winters, he now spends 8 months in Florida. And what I got involved and got asked to be on the cemetery committee, and did, and joined the cemetery committee. And as Eddie became more involved in his Florida synagogue and Florida community, he's now spending 8 months there. And Scott Barton and myself became co-chairs of the cemetery committee. So most recently, the fence on the German cemetery, I'm sorry, that's how I call it, the Hebrew Cemetery Society's cemetery came down. It was going to cost $20,000 to replace it. And Bob Raymond, the son of Judy and Jim, who was now taking care of the German cemetery, with so few members, didn't have the funds to replace it, and came to us and said, how about if we give you another piece of land adjacent to your cemetery and you fix our fence for us? We spent the $20,000 on their fence, and we got another piece of land to last us even longer for our members. So Scott and I are the co-chairs. We have probably 10 members on our committee of synagogue folks, and we're the ones who go out there and mark the site for the excavator. We mark the site for headstones. We're there at every funeral to make sure that everything is done right. So it's a wonderfully active committee. Fortunately, with our small membership and our young membership, we don't have a lot of funerals, but we do what we can. And Tahara, to be buried in our cemetery, you have to have Jewish Tahara means purification, and it's the Jewish way of preparing a deceased for burial. The funeral homes don't prepare our deceased for burial. You have to have a Jewish tahara, Jewish funeral, kosher funeral preparation in order to be buried in our Jewish cemetery. That's not the case, of course, where we're burying non-Jews in the interfaith cemetery, although our Jewish members who are buried there, we also do purification, tahara for.
So you do go to funeral homes and use their facilities, but it's all Jewish men or Jewish women downstairs preparing the body through the ritual purification.
That is correct. There's a women's Chevra Kadisha and a men's Chevra Kadisha. And in this day and age, the question came up, a trans person, transgender person, wanted to be on the Chevra Kadisha, to do tahara. So the question is, which sex? They hadn't gone through a sex change, but they were self-identifying as the sex of choice. Well, in a conservative shul, the rabbi is the posek, is the decider, is the ritual decider on Jewish practice. So I said to this transgender person, go talk to the rabbi, find out from the rabbi what you and he think is the appropriate committee for you to join, and that's the committee you join, and that's the committee you go and do the purification with. That person ultimately got a job out of Boston and moved. So we didn't have that opportunity to institute, to act on that request.
So that brings me to the ritual committee. Can you tell me who were some of the people over the years who've been active in the ritual committee?
The Gabbai was always on the committee and usually the chair of the committee. And originally it was knowledgeable members. So Mel Prauser, of course, as the Gabbai, was on it. And I'm going to look at some names because I'm going to forget. Leonard Alberts, of course, was on it. Leonard Alberts was one of our, it's so hard in rural America, in conservative shuls, to discuss, and I say that because the original members of our shul were all the businessmen on Main Street. They owned all the stores on Main Street. And in those days, our Main Street closed up at 5 o'clock, so they were all at services Friday night. But guess what? Stores were all open Saturday morning. So it didn't matter how religious you were. If you had a store on Main Street, you were at your store Saturday mornings. So Friday nights were our big services at the time. And someone like Leonard Alberts, who in his older years became conservadox, at that time was coming Friday evenings. And he was always on the ritual committee because he had the knowledge and the desire, if not the practice. And in those days, there were Saturday mornings when the only people at shul was the rabbi and the Gabbai. And they decided, let's go play golf. And I've heard this story from Mel Prauser personally.
Are we talking 60 years ago? What are we talking?
Yes. We're talking 80 years ago. We're talking with our first rabbi, Rabbi Langenauer.
Really?
Yes, that first rabbi that I knew. That this was a story I heard from Mel about what Saturday mornings were like at the shul when there were 100 members and they were all business people and all working Saturdays. He was an accountant, so he was off Saturdays, Mel. But that's a long time ago, and you see how far and how much we've changed
there are not as many businessmen nowadays who are members, who used to really be the pillar of support for the shul. There are much more now lawyers, doctors, teachers, what have you.
Professors,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And nowadays, we have a hard time getting a minyan Friday night, and we're full Saturday mornings. So Cleo, my wife Cleo, and I showed up on a Friday night for services, and there were 4 of us there. We came the next morning, Saturday morning, there were 50, 60 people there. So the changes over time have been quite dramatic.
But they do get a turnout now on Friday night, do they not?
When we have a special Friday night service, we've got 30, 40, 50 people. And a special Friday night service could be a musical service with instruments. Of course, our conservadox young folks don't like that. And my comment to them at a recent ritual committee meeting was, well, Friday night, I was there with 4 other people. The Orthodox, the folks who want us to be more traditional aren't coming to Friday night services. But when we have musical Friday night services, we get 50, 60 people. All of our other folks are turning out for that. So you're going to say we shouldn't encourage them to come to shul? We should do it your way, and you're not coming to shul to make the minyan? I'm not in favor of that. So interesting times we live in. So no, we don't get a turnout on Friday night unless it's a special program. Then we'll get a turnout for it.
Do you recall if there ever was a time where they had Monday or Thursday minions?
I'm stuttering because what happens in our shul is when there's someone who wants a minyan and therefore organizes it and lets people know and has ongoing contact with them, we get a minyan. Yes, Monday and Thursday was going on for a while. Then it was because someone needed to say Kaddish, and he was available in the mornings, that we had a morning minyan. And then when we lost that organizer, it shifted to the afternoon, to a 5:30 service. And again, as long as there's somebody organizing it, we get at least a minyan. When someone stops organizing it, we don't. So it depends on the motivation of the person in charge.
Can you speak to what some of the issues that you've seen at the ritual committee had over the years? What are some of the major decisions and changes you had to make in terms of the synagogue and its service, what were some of the issues?
Wow. Of course, there are always issues. And I'm sure originally when it changed from Orthodox to conservative, that must have been an enormous discussion at the synagogue board because it started Orthodox. And then when we hired our first non-conservative rabbi, when we hired our Reconstructionist rabbi, that was quite a discussion at the ritual committee meeting as well as the board, because it had to be approved, and we were affiliated with the conservative movement. And the conservative movement always pushes for their rabbis because they have to find jobs for their rabbis. So that was a big discussion going on in the ritual committee. The whole issue of an interfaith cemetery was very challenging. Phil Graubart, who was the rabbi at the time, fortunately was supportive of it. And because of the homework I did and the presentation I made around how we were keeping it separate, and that as long as it was separate and we weren't running it, we squeaked by. And I say squeaked by because the synagogue cemetery committee still were the people who taught and participated with the committee that ran the interfaith cemetery. And there were so few burials, 3 now, after 20 plus years, that committee just dissipated, and we, the synagogue cemetery, have taken on the role. So I don't know if that's going to come up in the future as a discussion about, is that okay? And as a matter of fact, Mel's son, who's a very traditional conservative rabbi, when we were discussing this, to do or not to do, called me up and told me how opposed he was to it, because his mother was buried there and he didn't want the Jewish cemetery to be made non-kosher. So I got an earful from him about that. Yeah.
Were there ever issues about prayer and liturgy and the words used in prayer or the prayer books?
Oh, how interesting. Because we have Smith College in Northampton, a number of our members are professors at Smith College and in the Judaica department. Martha Acklesberg, a retired Smith College professor who joined the cemetery committee, raised the issue of God language. And the rest of us on the cemetery committee didn't have...
Ritual committee.
I'm sorry, thank you. The rest of us on the ritual committee didn't have quite a foundational understanding of what she meant by that. So she sent her partner, spouse now, Judith Plaskow, who has written quite a number of books on feminism and Judaism, who is also a retired professor, had written just on this subject. So she sent me the chapter from her book on this subject, and which also explained the whole idea of God language.
What does that mean, God language? How do you refer to God?
Exactly.
As a she or a he or what?
Exactly. How do you refer to God in this age of feminist Judaism?
Okay.
That was where she was coming from. I read the material. I came back to the committee and I shared my understanding, and I shared Judith's recommendation, which was you start by having a separate group who uses this new exploration of God language and fine-tunes it to what they then would find useful, promote, and then bring it in to the larger service, to the sanctuary. So I put all this out to the committee, and I said to the committee, okay, who would like to chair this subcommittee to look into God language? And we have so many members who are feminists and who are egalitarian, and I thought, easy to get a committee together. Nobody volunteered to chair it. So I turned to Martha and I said, Martha, this was your idea. Would you like to chair that committee? She said no. That ended that discussion. I must say it was after that discussion that Leonard Alberts left the committee. He resigned from the committee because he said, I'm not here for theoretical discussions. I'm here to make sure that what we do is right and that we meet the needs of our committee. And this current group of people on the committee are more into theoretical discussions. I'm sorry, I can't participate in this anymore.
So the Ed Feld Situr that you use now, I think, right?
Yes,
That replaced Sim Shalom?
correct.
How is the God language in that? Top of your head.
In the English, it's very acceptable. The Hebrew is standard.
So it'll say Hamelech and the king and who, he.
Correct.
The English is...
The English is very acceptable. And the new book has all kinds of excerpts from other authors to enhance the service, including authors like Judith Plaskow and modern authors to enrich the text. That's not acceptable to all. So recently, we have people who have had aliyot, who have changed the Hebrew in the prayers to feminine. Brucha at. And that's really only in the past year, less than a year, we would always have somebody who would come from Reform to reconstruct the synagogue that we gave an aliyah who would do that. But now we're having some of our members do that. So it's interesting shifts that go on. And I spoke with Justin, our rabbi, about, Justin, you're going to be caught in the middle of this balance between our interfaith and our feminist group and between our traditionalists who are wanting us to follow more of the rules and be more traditional. And you're going to be stuck in the middle because you're our posek. And I left it there because it's going to be a challenge to meet both needs at the same time.
And the conservative movement, JTS, may not have come out with any directive.
Correct.
It may be left up to each rabbi, and the conservative movement is evolving itself.
Exactly.
Through its own changes.
Exactly.
Ryan, could you talk about, you're known throughout the community as one who visits people who are homebound, who are sick, who are elderly, who are in need of visits. How did that come about? I know there's a Bichur Cholim committee at the synagogue to visit the ill, but you are known in the community as one who takes care of people. How did that all evolve?
By happenstance. Some of our active members became homebound, housebound, where they had an aide 24/7, deaf, and couldn't participate anymore. They reached the point, and for me, it was Sari Merrill. Sari and Lester were lifelong members, full participants, board members, sisterhood members, organizers, whatnot, and reach an age where they're using a walker, where Sari couldn't even go down to meals in her assisted living anymore because people would be talking around the table, and even with her hearing aids, she couldn't hear them. They would ask her questions, and she couldn't even participate in this discussion. And that's how locked in, when I mean housebound, I mean it's she and her aide in the apartment. So I started visiting. I knew this was happening, and I started visiting even before it got that bad. That's how bad it was at the end. But, you know, she's a member of the shul. We didn't have a chesed committee then. So I did that. I visited regularly. And other members of the shul, Bernice Alberts, similarly ended up being mostly at home. And Cleo, who had a special relationship with her, would visit her regularly as well. So it was hearing about these people who were not able to get out anymore, or were in assisted livings or in nursing homes, and not all Jewish, that we started visiting.
You and Cleo?
Separately. I by myself, Cleo by herself. So a former member, Vera Wishnow, who is in a nursing home and not getting out, Cleo makes a point of stopping in there and visiting her. The chef at the local hospital happens to be Jewish, and the nephew of a member brought his father up from Florida because his father was in his 90s, and he knew his father would need more attention. And I hear from our members that the father's here and over at this assisted living. I go over and visit with him. So it really was through connections that I started doing this. And I know it's meaningful to the people at home. And it's meaningful to me. We share our stories. Another members, and often I come from Brooklyn, right? Well, you should know how many Jews come from Brooklyn. So Abe Stern was in an assisted living or in a facility, and his daughter is a former member, and her husband is a current member, and I hear that he's here, so I stop in and visit him, and we visit. We talk about Brooklyn days. of course there's some dementia involved. So we can talk about Brooklyn Days every time I come. Because he doesn't remember me, and he doesn't remember that I've heard this story before. So we have some things in common to share, and then I can ask him to share other parts of his life. So it enriches me as well, and that's how it started. And now we have a very active Chesed committee, which is quite wonderful. Susan Mosler and Maxine Stein are the chairs of that. They have other members who take on monthly responsibility for accepting the names of people who need help. Could be a drive to a doctor. It could be visits. We have Eleanor Adelson's daughter, Susan Adelson, who was very ill and in bed at home. Has a husband who was out working, so wasn't there often, who Cleo and I heard about, and we went to visit because we knew her mother so well and knew her growing up, so we knew her, and we went to visit, and we brought a prayer book, and we sang prayers with her, and she loved it so much. Cleo suggested to her, would you like a group to come and sing to you? And she said she'd love it. So Cleo got involved with Marcios, a member of the shul, who is part of a singing group, who is looking for places to go and sing. And Marcy brought a small number of her friends who sang with her over to Susan's house to sing to her in her bedroom. That's the wide variety of offerings our Chesed committee now offers to our members. We still go out, Cleo and I go out to people we know or to people whose children we know because it's more personal, and we tend to do it regularly. So we get to know these people, they get to know us, even those with dementia. There's, and I say non-Jewish as well, a woman who leads our Tai Chi class has a mother in her 90s who's in a dementia ward, and most people know that dementia wards are locked wards in a facility. And she saw me there visiting one of our members in the building. And she said, oh, Ron, if you're ever here, I'd love you to stop in and see my mom. She's a pianist, and she would love to go down to the piano in the lobby of the nursing home and play the piano. So sure enough, I'm visiting other people there. I stop in and see her. I ask her, I tell her who I am every time. I tell her who I am and how I know her and that I know her daughter, and that makes the connection. And I ask her if she'd like to go down and play the piano, or if I could take her for a walk in her wheelchair around the facility, outdoors, and get some sun. So, you know, these connections bring me into contact with people of all religions. And as a matter of fact, Cleo and I were members of a senior support group called Challenges of Aging with Grace. And two seniors who were part of the support group are Quakers. And the husband ended up in a nursing home for rehab. And unfortunately, I visited him at rehab because I knew him from the group. And unfortunately, after rehab, he got to stay in the nursing home. He couldn't go home because he needed more care. So I visited him regularly. So it developed on its own.
One could say that what you're doing is Gimilut Chasadim or a mitzvah, but I think it sounds to me for you that it's like a prayer. It's like you're praying, you're connecting with the divine, so to speak. It's a very spiritual kind of endeavor. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I never looked at it that way, but it is certainly meaningful to me, and that's why I do it. And actually, Cleo was sick, not sick, she had surgery and then needed recuperation and rehab and was home-based. And being home-based meant that I was there taking care of her. So it's been a while since I've been out visiting folks, and I do miss it. So that's been hard for me, actually. Folks that I was seeing regularly that I haven't seen in over a month.
Can you tell me some things about, yeah, it must be difficult.
Yeah,
Because it's like you're in withdrawal, so to speak.
Exactly.
You need to get back to it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Can you tell me some things about Cleo, about your wife? You've mentioned her. Tell me some things about her life, what she's involved with, what she's been involved with, and what you both did for a living. You haven't mentioned that. Tell us some things about your life together.
Sure. Cleo and I met in Wurzweiler School of Social Work, which is the social work school of Yeshiva University. And she caught my eye right away. I coming from Yeshiva, and 8/10 of the students at Wurzweiler were all Jewish, coming from a similar background as mine. My uniform at the time were black chinos, white shirt, black pointy shoes, and black socks. That's what I wore every day. I had lots of, more than one of each, of course, but that was my uniform. Cleo, who came from an active political background, who was in Vista for 2 years, where she met 3 Wurzweiler professors. She was not Jewish at the time, but who were supervising her Vista group in Manhattan, and was so impressed with their knowledge. She was an English teacher at the time. She decided she wanted to learn what they knew. And they were all at Wurzweiler. And that's where she was going. Cleo did not have a Jewish background. She was half Greek Orthodox and half Scotch Catholic, ending up at Wurzweiler among all us Jews. And she was there with these outrageous hats, these outrageous colors, and she was a cigarette smoker. At the time, everybody smoked, and even at the time, you could smoke in Wurzweiler's lunchroom. She had this long ivory cigarette holder that she got on a trip to Yugoslavia from someone she met on a woman she met on a train. So here she was, this dramatic person at Yeshiva University. Boy, did she stand out. Well, we met, of course, we were students, and we were both in the group work sequence, so all of our classes were together. And that's how our relationship started and developed. And she got me involved politically. So we became anti-war activists. That was the Vietnam War era. We became activists in the grape workers' strike that was going on in California at the time, attempting to unionize. I had to drop out of Wurzweiler because I wasn't sure social work was for me, and I was there because it gave me a graduate school deferment, and I wasn't going to Vietnam. I had 4 years of college student deferment. At the time, they still had graduate school deferment, so I decided I was active in Young Judea, a Jewish Zionist youth movement, and I loved group work, and I loved working with kids, so I could see making a career of being a Young Judea professional or some other group work professional. I was suddenly involved in all this political stuff. Well, I saved enough money and got a passport, had a passport, and if I was going to be drafted, I was going to Israel. I wasn't a pacifist. I wasn't going to lie and, claim something I wasn't. But if I had to fight, I was going to fight for something I believed in, and I believed in Israel as a Zionist, and that's where I was going to go. So there I was. I couldn't continue at Yeshiva University because they did away with graduate school deferments, but they still had work deferments. So I got involved with teaching because teaching was a work deferment. And since I was not certified to teach, or I had a few credits, education credits, I started working in a private school for seriously disabled students in Manhattan, and got my deferment again. And then it went to the lottery, and I lucked out and I pulled a high number. And I enjoyed teaching so much, it was time to learn what it was all about. So I went to Philadelphia, and at that point, Cleo and I had been involved for 2 years, and she came to Philadelphia with me. And we had a son who was, when we went to Philadelphia, he was just born, and prior to our move there, and became involved politically. After Philadelphia, after getting my degree, we went to Israel. That was our trip to Israel with a 1-year-old. We brought diapers. We learned very quickly that 49 years ago, there were 3 laundromats in the whole country: Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. And Pampers had just come out, and even then we were environmentalists, and we were not going to use throwaway diapers. We brought a duffel bag with real diapers, and we're washing diapers by hand. We went to Israel on a freighter. Fun story. I don't know if I should go on with this. We went to Israel on a freighter, and I called this Yugoslavian freighter and said, "We're bringing a baby with diapers. Do you have a laundry service there?" They said, "Oh yeah, we have a laundry, no problem." We had a bucket full of, excuse my language, shitty diapers. I go to the person who was there helping us. This was a freighter, so there were only a few of us passengers. And I said, "Where's the laundry? I have diapers to wash." He took me 2 levels below water level, showed me a sink, and handed me one of those scrub boards. If you ever tried cleaning a shitty diaper on a scrub board and then hanging it up to dry, it's not something you want to do as a habit. And the diapers come out so hard, you don't want to put it against your baby's skin. So there we were in Israel for 6 months, learning how to cope with that kind of thing. I, as a Zionist, was hoping Cleo would fall in love with Israel and would want to move there. That was not the case. She did not have my background. To her, it was another wonderful country to visit. And just like she went to Yugoslavia and she went to Mexico, this was a nice trip, but I'm ready to go home now. So we came home, and she eventually she had always valued Jewish values and ethics. At Wurzweiler, one of the mandatory courses was Jewish values. One a semester that talked about first what Jewish values were, and then the next semester how to integrate it in practice. And it brought her closer to Judaism, so that eventually she did convert, and we did create a Jewish home and joined synagogues. And in Philadelphia, we joined a synagogue that was run by the Reconstructionist movement, because the straight synagogues didn't want a kid in the shul or just didn't speak to us.
You moved up here and you became a guidance person or a teacher in the East Hampton system, and Cleo became a guidance or social worker. Can you tell us about that?
I got my degree in special education, and Cleo got her degree in social work. And I was looking for a job, and I got a job. I was the only special education back in the early 70s were for the retarded. So we had a separate class room with a teacher of what now we would call the developmentally disabled. And then the other kids were what, as a child, as a teenager, we would nickname FLK, funny looking kids. They were bright enough, but they were different. Or they were bright enough, but weren't learning the way other kids learned. And I was hired as a teacher of the perceptually handicapped with federal Title I money that the East Hampton School Committee got. There were 2 of us hired, and we actually were hired to include work in the parochial schools. So my work was in going to 2 parochial schools. East Hampton was an unusual community. It had 3 elementary parochial schools in town, and it was the only town in the entire county, and it was a small town of 15,000, that had any elementary parochial schools. 1 for the Irish, 1 for the French Canadian, and 1 for the Polish. I got the Irish and the Polish schools. The second person hired got the French Canadian school. And we each got a couple of elementary schools to work with the perceptually handicapped. That title changed over time. Responsibilities changed over time, but I was always a special ed teacher. And it moved from being system-wide in East Hampton, where I did the evaluations in the high school, in the middle school, but taught in the elementary school. And then, of course, I couldn't work in the parochial schools anymore, but their kids could come to the elementary school to do it. And as staffing increased, I got centered in the elementary schools. Cleo started working at the state hospital as a social worker, and worked at Belchertown State School, which was for younger folks, children who were developmentally disabled, multi-handicapped adults who were developmentally disabled, where they transitioned there. She worked there as well. She also worked at the university at Every Women's Center, and then decided, gee, Ron and our son Alex are off all these school vacations and off during the summer, and I'm going to work. I think I'll look for a school social work job. And by that time, Chapter 766, the special education law, was implemented, and they had to start evaluating children for emotional and social needs that were impacting their learning. And Cleo applied for the social work job as a special ed staff person to do the evaluations and try to ameliorate the disability that was causing them not to succeed in school. And therefore was on a school schedule with us.
And she worked in East Hampton also?
No, she worked in Northampton. She was in the Northampton schools. I was in the East Hampton schools. We were each doing evaluations. The schools are right next to the towns are right next to each other, and often families would move from one town to the other, and I'd be reading her evaluation on a new student that I got, and she'd be reading my evaluation on a new student that she got. So it was quite wonderful, our working together as well. Yeah.
And you both did about how many years in the school system?
Oh, over 30, both of us, yeah, in the school systems. And over years, the jobs changed, the responsibility changed, the schools changed. Things surely from the 70s to today are totally different.
So you have the pleasure, when you're walking around town or going for a walk, to see a lot of the kids who are now grown-ups, and I bet they remember you.
It's so much fun, I have to tell you. We're riding our bikes on the bike trail, and all of a sudden, and there's a wonderful bike trail in East Hampton that's flat, and all of a sudden I hear yelled at, there are these young adults over here having a get-together, and I hear someone yell out, "Yo, Mr. A, hi!" And I pull over, and of course I don't recognize these kids because they were in elementary school when I knew them, but I say, okay, tell me who you are. And we would have this lovely discussion, and I would remember some siblings, or of course the parents from way back. Cleo still always loved her colors and loved her flamboyance, and always got into having her nails done and monthly changing their colors and wearing matching things that went with her nails. And the kids loved it. They would come into her room, and the first thing they would do is look to see what color her nails were. Nowadays, she's 80, I'm almost, we go to the supermarket, and the cashier grabs Cleo's hand and goes to look at her nails. And Ken says to her, oh, you remember me, I'm so-and-so. And Cleo would light up and says, I'm so glad, the cashier would say, I'm so glad you're still doing your nails. So it's a treat for both of us.
You're involved in lots of activities. I know you love to dance together.
Right.
I know you're involved in the senior center.
Yeah.
And I know you love to travel.
Yeah.
You've had a very active life, both of you.
Yes, very active. It's a little harder now at our age where we can't be as active. So that is a challenge. Cleo more so than I at this point. She's 6 years older than I am. So it's helpful for me, but not for her, to see what's coming down the line in terms of when I turn 80. And what's so amazing is changes happen very quickly and unexpectedly. So that at 78, you're out biking 20 miles. And all of a sudden at 80, you've got to be happy with 5 or 6 miles. It's eye-opening. And as I say, it's helpful for me to see what's coming down the line to prepare me for the things that I won't be able to do in just a few years. There are those changes that we're living with. But yes, we're still dancing, which is great. We still go to Tai Chi, which is great. And there's an organization in Northampton that its purpose is to make the outdoors accessible to all, regardless of handicap, disability, or ability. And they have these recumbent trikes and have special times for folks like us. So we get to go out and bike on the bike trails on their recumbent trikes. So we're still doing that.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about your mother's family.
Wow.
Okay? You brought some pictures along. Can you tell me about your mother's family? You said your father's family was Ashkenaz and spoke, if I remember correctly, spoke Yiddish. Tell me about your mother's family and how they met, and tell me about them.
My mother's a Syrian Jew. And the Syrian community, I'm not sure it's changed much. The Syrian community is a very closed community. You marry within the Syrian community. And until recently, marriages were arranged, although more recently the children have to agree to it and won't accept just that it's arranged. My mother's family was different from most Syrian families because my grandfather was one of those classic wandering Jews. Here, I'm going to point out my grandparents, who are on this side of the picture. And then I'm going to put that down so I can leave this one up, which is my grandparents' family, with my grandmother, older, in the middle, at this wedding of one of her sons.
No, leave it up. We're getting a little glare.
Oh, okay.
Who's who in the picture?
Oh, grandmother. I'm going to have to hold it this way so I can see. My mother and father, Rose and Ben. My Uncle Victor and his wife-to-be Ginger. My Aunt Frida and her husband Ralph. My Uncle Joe and my Aunt Renee. And my older sister Lenore. I was not born yet. So that's the Syrian side of my family. Of course, all their children were born and grandkids, and so the extended family is much larger. I said my grandfather was a wandering Jew. My mother's parents were both born in Aleppo in Syria. To my knowledge, and my grandmother, whom I knew, only spoke Arabic. Both of their families moved from Aleppo to Cairo. I don't know why. They met in Cairo and married. I understand from the stories that my grandfather was a healer and an herbalist. And he would set up shop in Cairo, as he did. And after 7 or 8 years, maybe he wasn't so good at it, I don't know, but he decided he needed to move somewhere where he could make a better living. And Syrians traveled the world as business people and settled everywhere they traveled. And that included their family. They have an unusual Syrian last name of Bijo. B-I-G-I-O is how they spelled it. But it's not an uncommon name and can be spelled in many ways. I'll leave that at that. And they had family all around the world. So he would move to where the family was to set up business. And every 7 or 8 years, he would move to where some other family members were. So one of my uncles was born in South America, where they had family in Guatemala. Another one was born in Paris, where they had family in Paris. My mother and her twin sister were born in Haiti because there was family in Haiti. And my understanding is the last family member in Haiti just died about 5 years ago. His children, and like all the Syrians that I know, was a businessman. He owned a department store in the capital city of Haiti. So he was considered moneyed in Haiti. As his children grew and wanted to set up their own businesses, they started moving away from Haiti because they wanted to live in other communities besides what was so limiting to them in Haiti. But when my grandfather was looking for places to go to, Haiti was one of them. And they lived there for 7 years, because my mother was 7 years old when they moved from Haiti to Paris. And at one point, and I remember a memory my mother shared with me was how upsetting it was when she must have been 5 or 6 and she was playing with neighborhood kids on the street. Neighborhood kids in Haiti are black. And her mother came out, dragged her in the house and said, "You are not allowed to play with those kids anymore." And my mother was telling me this story when she was 60 or 70. So it was so scarring to her to be taken away from her friends that it never went away. She ends up in Paris because her father was going to start a new business there. But he went without money. So, or not much, and the family went with him. So her 1 or 2 brothers who were born by them were sent to military school, dorming at the military school. She and her sister were sent to a Catholic residential school run by the nuns at age 7. And living there. So my grandfather and grandmother were working to set up the business. And at one point, they were walking, kids were home, they were walking by a church, and my mother and her twin sister stopped and kneeled and crossed themselves. that's when my grandparents knew it was time to leave Paris. This was not going to work. And that's when they went on to another country. And then they came to the States, and to Brooklyn, as a matter of fact, because there was a big Syrian community in Brooklyn. And Grandpa decided to go to Mexico because the girls were getting old enough, they were 16 now, that he was wanting to marry them off.
They were twins?
My mother and her twin sister. And went to Mexico City, where he had family and where there was another big Syrian community. Jewish community. And found a family, brought pictures of the twins, of my mother and her twin sister. And by that time, by the way, my mother hadn't met my father, but she was out working already to help support the family. She only made it to 8th grade before she had to go get a job helping to support the family. They were poor. My grandfather took off to Mexico and wired my grandmother he's coming home. And my grandmother said, "Don't come back. I don't want you here. I'm getting food stamps." It wasn't food stamps back then, but I'm getting welfare, and I'm getting some money to help support the kids, and they're out working, helping to support. I don't want you back here. I'll lose that. So I never met him. He stayed in Mexico and must have died there. I don't know anything else about him, but I did meet my grandmother. And so my mother was out doing what she could do, and so was her sister and the boys. They were all doing their thing. And my grandfather lets Grandma know that he's arranged this wedding with a Syrian family called Chayo, C-H-A-Y-O. Syrian family, good background, Mexicans, and that he wasn't sure which, they looked the same, the twins, they were identical twins. He wasn't sure which one he was going to marry, but he's coming to visit to see them to decide. And sure enough, he came to the States, he met the two of them, and I guess their personalities were a little different, and chose my mother's sister to take back to Mexico. Not yet, but to finish the arrangements to marry her. Meanwhile, my mother's learning the trade on how to do women's nails and men's nails, and she was working in a beauty parlor. And my father, who was working at a butcher shop for his older brother-in-law, one of his half-sisters was, I mentioned they were much older, was married, and the brother-in-law owned a butcher shop. And he was working there, and he was walking by the shop where my mother was working, you know, doing nails and seeing her doing nails, and somehow she caught his eye because he went in to have his nails done. Hard to imagine, but that's what he did. And he came back every week to have his nails done till he got her to go out with him. And I'm sure her family was not very happy about it, but they made enough of a connection that they decided to get married. The Syrian community ostracized them, not her sisters and brothers who all belonged to the Syrian shul. My father belonged to the Ashkenazi little conservative shul a few blocks down. In Brooklyn, there were a dozen shuls to choose from within walking distance. But that's where he joined, and that's where my mother became a member, of course, once she married him. And the Syrian, other than the immediate family, she was no longer part of the Syrian community. That's how closed the community this was. And when I became 16 and was looking for a job, my uncle, my mother's brother, owned a store in Manhattan. We were all in Brooklyn. And so I went to my uncle and I said, "Do you know anybody where I could get a job?" I was only, I wasn't even 16. I was probably 15. And he said, "Well, you're not going to come work for me in Manhattan. You're too young and it's too much of a schlep and it's a delivery job. No. But I have a cousin who owns a store in Manhattan. where I'm sure he could use a stock boy. The Syrians owned a lot of the stores in Times Square that sold tchotchkes and tourist stuff and cameras and pocket radios and electronics. And, he knew them, and many of them were related, cousins. So he called the cousin. The cousin said, bring him over. I went over, visited the cousin. Cousin asked about my background. What shul do I belong to? Where do I go to school? And the cousin never hired me. I was not a Syrian. My father had left the butcher business much earlier because at the time, it was towards the end of the Depression, and meat was rationed, and brother-in-law was selling meat under the table, and my dad was concerned about legal stuff, and went to one of his other half-sisters who owned a store delivering coats and aprons and towels to storekeepers, and had washing machines to do their own washing. She owned a bigger business, and said to her, can I start working for you? And she said yes. And then he broke away and started his own business like that. So I was never part of the Syrian community. I was never accepted there because I'm a half Ashkenazi. But I loved my Syrian part of the family, of course, and loved going to the Syrian shul and hearing their nigunim, they didn't call it that, but their melodies and all of that stuff. Yeah.
And Syrian food?
Syrian food. My mother never made it because my father only ate Ashkenazi food. But I would go to my Syrian aunts and uncles, and when they did Pesach, there was rice on the table. And I was shocked, of course, because I went to the Ashkenazi family for the Seder. No rice, I mean, the differences were so dramatic at the two, and the melodies and the tunes and everything was so dramatically different, and I loved them both.
Your father's family accepted his marriage.
Oh yeah, there was no issue there. We lived with my father's
all
family.
lived together.
We all lived, that was the building, my whole father's family, right? So there was no problem there.
And you were told that when you were like 17, your father wasn't well and you had to take over his route?
It wasn't 17 because there were two times that my father had heart attacks. The first time he had a driver, a non-Jewish driver, that was running the route, and he had me go with the driver because it was a cash route. It was a small business. He would go to one of these outdoor hot dog stands and sell and rent the guy for a week 3 aprons at 15 cents an apron. This was the business, right? Because every 15 cents added up. And you have enough of these little, you could afford to support your family. So that's what he was, and I had to go because it was cash, and he didn't trust the driver. The second time it happened, I not only had to, I was in college then, so it impacted my schoolwork anyway. I had to leave my job at the dry goods store where I was working and run my father's, I had to drive then too, I was driving at the time, and run his route and pay the bills for the business and deliver the dirty laundry to the commercial folks who were washing it, pick up the clean laundry. I had to do all the setting up of the route so that there was things there for each stop that we were going to do. My mother helped with that. And I couldn't imagine how he supported the family on that income because I was paying the bills now. And I was bringing in the cash. I was depositing the cash. I was writing out the checks for whatever the bills were that coming into the business, and I wasn't balancing the books. And I couldn't believe that we were still eating. It explained to me why I was so embarrassed by the way my mother dressed when I was a young child. My mother would take us around the corner to a dungaree factory, it was called. There was a storefront that, yeah, they had the machines in the back, and they were making jeans and chinos, and there was a second rack, and that's where I would go to get my clothes. But my mother would wear around the house these house dresses that I was embarrassed about. They were rags. We would get clothes to wear to school and stuff. When she would go out, she would wear something a little bit better than that. But in the house, in those house dresses, and then when I ran his business and I saw what the bills were, I understood what was going on.
You had compassion for what she was.
Wow. And, you know, I hated his business because you would go into the back rooms of these shops and restaurants, and the dirty shirts and pants and aprons were thrown in a barrel. And I would take them out of the barrel, and I would have to shake the bugs off them. In Manhattan, you know, I can only tell you what it's like in the back of these stores that people go to eat in that they think are fancy stores. I would shake the bugs out before I would bring them into the truck to take to the laundry. But it grossed me out. My father, when he retired, wanted me to take over the business. Not a prayer's chance was I going to take over that business. Well, I couldn't do it. But he's...
And what happened to your mother's twin who married the guy in Mexico?
The Mexican family did very well. He owned a paint... not he. His son owned a paint shop. So the next generation, like my generation, we went to school, we got jobs, we made successes out of ourselves. My parents' generation, they were just they were working hard. So she went to Mexico. 30 years later, her children were successful enough to send her back to the States to visit her twin sister. For that many years, they didn't see each other. And
did you get to meet your aunt?
I got to meet my aunt, and oh, there's a fun story where my aunt came to visit. I was still young then, and she came in the room to say goodnight to me, I thought. And I cried and screamed, and I want my mother. I don't want you. Because they looked identical.
They still did.
They still did. And my mother had to come over and reassure me, I'm your mother. I'll go get your aunt and bring her in here. Because that's how identical they were. I mistook my mother for my aunt. I mean, that's the whole scene.
Your grandfather died in Mexico?
I never met him. My grandmother lived around the corner from us. And another fun story. Even though I was at a yeshiva, we all went trick-or-treating. I never knew that Halloween was a Christian holiday. I didn't know its roots. I went to Halloween parties. I went trick-or-treating. You know, all the Jewish kids in my neighborhood did this stuff. And it didn't matter that I was at yeshiva. Nobody told us at yeshiva about that holiday, that we shouldn't be doing that. Never knew. Heard about Christmas. That's different. My friends and I would go around the neighborhood and count how many menorahs we saw and how many Christmas trees we saw. And that way we could decide if this was our neighborhood or theirs. But we didn't know that about Halloween. So I go to my grandmother's house. She was renting a room in a Syrian family's home. My friend and I are trick-or-treating. We knock on the door. Somebody opens a window on the second floor. We back up to see a bucket of water gets poured out of the window. Fortunately, we had stepped back, and it missed us. But, you know, the Syrians don't want people come trick-or-treating at their house. That's a no-no. They were more involved in their Judaism than we Ashkenazis were, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I kept knocking on the door. Somebody came to the door, and I said, I'd like to see my grandmother. So sure enough, they went and got my grandmother. So I said to my grandmother, trick-or-treat! Well, my grandmother didn't even speak English. She didn't know what this was all about. What do you mean, trick-or-treat? I said, hi, Gram. And I gave her a hug and a kiss. And I took her by the hand. And I walked her to the refrigerator. I opened the refrigerator. I took out a grapefruit. That was all that was in there. I said, hey, Gram, can we have this grapefruit? And she said, sure. You know, we communicated in whatever way we can. My friend and I went out. We peeled the grapefruit. We ate the grapefruit. So that's what it was like in Brooklyn in those days. Quite the scene. Back to your question. What was it? About Mexico, family, the twins. Yeah, I was raised Ashkenazi.
But you were given a very thorough education that prepared you to become the Gabbai and to really be a pillar of this CBI, I would say.
Today I appreciate it. Back then, I didn't need the extra work as a kid. I would have liked to be out with my friends at 3 o'clock in the afternoon playing ball instead of coming home at 5 o'clock to do oodles of homework with all the Jewish subjects as well as the English subjects. So it's an interesting flip.
And you appreciate the sacrifices that your parents made to guarantee that you would have a good life.
Oh boy, for sure. And they certainly did. For all of us, there were 4 of us. I have 3 sisters, so 3 sisters and myself.
And where are your 3 sisters? What became of them briefly?
Lenore got her master's degree and married a doctor and invested his money and moved to Florida. He actually he came from a family like mine and got to go to college, like Lenore did, and decided he wanted to be a doctor. And after having worked through college, had enough money to get into, and smarts to get into medical school and pay his first couple of years, but couldn't do it anymore, and enlisted in the military because they would pay for him to finish his medical school, and he would have to pay them back 1 extra year of service for every year that he studied. And not only did he get his medical degree, he went on through their payments to become a cardiologist and get certified as a cardiologist. So he had to pay back a lot of years to the military, but he loved it. Why? He had a 9-to-5 job. He was an officer. He was married with kids. He had a house on base, and he got to go to the best trainings that anybody could go to at their expense and their time off. He would have stayed in and made a career of it. After 15 years, they wanted to send him to Vietnam as a field doctor because they ran out of what we call primary care, general physicians, to do that. They didn't have people to send, and they were pulling all kinds of specialists. By then, he had paid back his time, and he said, "Sorry, I'm out of here." And they said, "No, you can't get out. You're ours. You're in now. We're sending you to Vietnam. It's wartime." He took them to court. It was military court, I guess. And they said, "No, you're right. You want to get out? You paid back your time. Your tour is over. You don't have to stay." But he liked that so much, he didn't want to go into private practice, so he looked for a group practice to go into. It ended up in Florida. So they all ended up in Florida.
What about your other siblings?
They all ended up in Florida because that's where Lenore, my older sister, my parents were. So the whole family migrated to Florida, except us. We came north. One got a job with the telephone company, decided not to have kids. The other one became a art therapist and also got a job teaching in a school. And she also moved to Florida and works, still working down there, my 2 younger sisters. The other one retired already. So the family got educated, my generation got educated, and their kids were all educated. Yeah.
So your life, and Cleo's life, is an example of what dramatic changes can take place within one generation, from one parent generation making great sacrifices to assure the success with hard work and dedication of the next generation.
From the immigrant family to the first generation family. That's right. I'm always surprised when I talk to a peer of mine and they have a parent who went to college. I don't even have a parent who graduated high school or junior high school for that. Maybe my mother graduated junior high school, 8th grade. But, that they tell me the parent graduated. I said, when did your parents come here? Oh, your parents didn't. Your parents were born here. Oh, when did your grandparents come here? And then if they tell me the grandparents were born here, I really get big-eyed because everybody I knew was like me. Growing up. Everybody I knew growing up was just like me. The parents came here from the other side, and we were all first generation. Right? So, I get bug-eyed when people talk about, oh, yeah, they're...
And America really has been the land of opportunity.
Oh, no question about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there something that you wanted me to ask you that I didn't?
Oh. I love where I live. I love the friendships I've developed, the connections I've made, and Cleo and my involvement in community life, both Jewish and more general. And that's, I think, because of where we live. When I talk to my sisters, they have very different lives. So I feel blessed.
Thank you very much, Ron, for this interview.
Thank you, Ken.